The key was cold in Nora Callahan's hand. It wasn't much to look at. A piece of darkened iron, the shaft bent slightly to the left, as though someone had once twisted it in a moment of too much anger. She held it there, standing at the mouth of the mountain, the September sun cutting the Arizona sky in shades of orange and gray, and the wind coming down off the Mogollon Rim, carrying that smell of pine and dry earth she hadn't felt since childhood. Behind her, the lawyer waited. His name was Aldous Fitch, a thin man from Tucson with a sparse mustache and eyes that never quite held still. He had made the 3-day journey from the city carrying a brown leather satchel and an expression that mixed professional courtesy with something Nora couldn't quite name. Maybe it was pity, maybe it was something else entirely. "The law's clear, Miss Callahan," he had said that morning as they drank coffee at the Cimarron Creek boarding house. "Your grandfather left everything to you, the property, what remains of the cattle, and the mine." "I don't want the mine," she had replied without lifting her eyes from the cup. "With all due respect, you don't have much say in that." And so here she was, key in hand, standing before a heavy wooden door, reinforced with iron bands, set into the raw rock on the eastern face of what the local men called the Sierra de los Cuervos, the Raven Range, a spur of mountain that cut through the territory northwest of Flagstaff. The door had a padlock the size of a closed fist, black with rust, waiting for at least 2 years, ever since Elias Callahan had died alone on the ranch. No family beside him, no last words passed on to anyone. Nora put the key in the lock. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, now would be a good time, because stories like this one, where an inheritance turns out to be less a gift and more a sentence, are exactly what we tell here. Subscribe and hit the bell. You'll want to be around when we reach the end of this one. The lock gave with a dry sound, like a bone snapping. Nora Callahan was 31 years old, and she had spent most of those years trying to forget where she came from. She was born on the Callahan Ranch, 42 miles northwest of Flagstaff, the daughter of Daniel Callahan, Elias's eldest son, and a woman named Rose who had died of fever when Nora was 7. Daniel was a man who drank more than he worked and loved his daughter the way certain men love things they don't know how to care for, with intensity during the bad moments and absence during the ones when she needed him present. When Nora was 12, Daniel left for Yuma, saying he had a debt to settle, and never came back. Elias, her grandfather, was 58 by then and carried a hardness that Nora had always confused with indifference. He was not a man of words. He was a man of hands. Hands that built fences, that branded cattle, that signed contracts in black ink with the steadiness of someone who has no doubts. Nora grew up under his roof for 4 more years, years in which she learned to ride, to read the weather by the color of the sky, and not to ask for what she didn't expect to receive. At 16, she went to Flagstaff to work in the dry goods shop of the widow Hester Price. By 18, she wrote without errors, tallied figures without using her fingers, and had saved enough to pay for a week of accounting lessons with a retired railroad instructor. By 23, she was the head bookkeeper at Dolan & Sons General Store and sent letters to her grandfather 3 or 4 times a year. He answered once every 18 months in large letters and short sentences and never signed with any warmth. Just his name, Elias Callahan. The last letter she received from him had arrived 18 months before his death. It said only, "The mine is closed. When I die, do not open it." She had folded the paper, placed it in the back of a drawer, and tried not to think about it anymore. But the dead have a way of insisting, and what Aldous Fitch had not said over coffee, but what he disclosed with considerably more care in the notary's office, papers spread across the table, and a witness seated in the corner, was that the mine was not merely closed. It had been sealed by agreement, not a legal order. Not exactly. It was more like a compact, the kind that men in the territory made among themselves when they didn't want the details reaching the law. Fitch had found a notation in Elias's papers, written in the old man's own hand, which read as follows: "The mine remains closed until I or my heir decide otherwise. Anyone who enters without permission answers to me. Witness, Vernon Cray, August 1881." Vernon Cray, Nora recognized the name immediately, the way one recognizes an old scar, not with pleasure, but with a familiarity that stings. Vernon Cray had been Elias's partner since the early days of the mine's operation, back in 1873. He was the one who had financed the first excavations when Elias had the land, but not the capital. He was the one who, according to the older men of Cimarron Creek, had quarreled bitterly with Elias at some point near the end of the decade. Nobody knew quite what about, but the partnership had ended, and Cray had gone to Prescott without any public explanation. Now Vernon Cray was 73 years old, lived in a large house in the center of Prescott, and was one of the wealthiest men in the territory. And according to Fitch, he had sent a representative to the notary's office 2 days after Elias's death, inquiring about the terms of the will. The door of the mine opened onto a darkness that smelled of wet earth, old powder, and something deeper and more mineral that Nora couldn't place right away. Fitch had brought lanterns. The man who accompanied him, a quiet fellow named Breck, who served as a kind of general assistant and carrier of things, lit the first one and went in ahead, ducking his head to clear the wooden frame. The tunnel was perhaps 8 feet high and wide enough for 2 men to walk side by side. The walls were dark rock with veins of white quartz that caught the lantern light and threw it back in fragments. The floor was packed earth, leveled with care. Someone had worked this space with attention, not in haste. Every 15 or 20 feet, a timber support braced the ceiling, and Nora noticed they were in good condition. Not rotted, not loosened by time. The mine had been maintained. Someone had entered after Elias sealed it, or just before sealing it for good, and made certain it would hold. Breck stopped after about 40 paces and raised the lantern. Nora saw. It was not gold, it was not silver, it was not the kind of not silver. It was not the kind of discovery that makes a man rich overnight. It was a chamber, hand-carved, wider than the tunnel, with walls smoothed by masonry tools. And on those walls, markings in charcoal, numbers, dates, names, columns of names. She stepped closer. The light trembled. The names were men's names, 17 of them, which she counted right there, though there were more higher up where the light didn't quite reach. Beside each name, a date between 1874 and 1879, and beside each date, a number, sometimes a value in dollars, sometimes just a number with no unit. Fitch was quiet for a moment that lasted too long. "What is this?" Nora asked, and her voice came out smaller than she intended. "Records," he said carefully. "Worker records, I believe. Workers who were paid or workers who were not?" He did not answer. The truth took 2.5 days to surface completely, and it came in pieces, as it always does. A document here, the memory of an old man there, a silence that stretched too long when the right question was asked. The Callahan mine had operated from 1873 to 1881 with decent silver production. In the early years, with workers brought in from Flagstaff and Prescott, paid on a regular basis. But beginning in 1875, when the partnership with Cray was at its peak and production had tripled, the payroll had changed. Not in the official documents. Those remained clean, signed with correct figures. But in the chamber records, written in Elias's own hand in that large and unadorned script, the story was different. Men working off debt, men who had arrived in the territory on passages paid by Cray, carrying signed agreements they had no way to read, committing years of labor in exchange for land that had never existed. Some were immigrants from Mexico. Some were men who had run into trouble with the law and accepted the work as an alternative to prison. Not understanding they were trading one kind of cage for another, 2 of the names had beside them the notation, "Died in service," with a date and no further explanation. Elias had recorded all of it. With the clinical precision of an accountant, he had documented every entry, every departure, every death. And then he had closed the mine in 1881, sealed the door, and never spoken of it again. The falling out with Vernon Cray, Nora began to understand, had not been about money. It had been about a line that Elias, at some late point in his life, had decided he would no longer cross. Too late to matter for the men whose names were on those walls, but early enough that he refused to continue. Sealing the door had been the act of a man who could not undo what had been done, but who could no longer bear to look at it. Vernon Cray arrived in Cimarron Creek on the afternoon of the third day, without being summoned. He was a man of 73 who carried his years with the posture of someone accustomed to having things come to him, not the other way around. He had well-kept white hair, a gray-blue wool coat that must have cost more than a month's wages for any worker in the region, and a dark wooden cane that he used more as an accessory of authority than as actual support. He came with 2 men on horseback behind him and asked to speak with Miss Callahan on the boarding house porch, as if he were doing her a favor by not demanding a formal office. Nora was seated when he climbed the steps. She did not stand. "Your reputation precedes you," he said with the smile of a man who practices smiling. "The mine's reputation preceded me," she replied. The smile didn't disappear, but something behind it went very still. Cray pulled out a chair and sat with the deliberate slowness of someone who doesn't want to appear hurried. "What you found in there," he said, lowering his voice, "are records of legitimate contracted labor operations, documents of the era in a different context. Well, the territorial law of 1875 permitted men to die in service and be buried without a name?" Nora asked, calm, her voice steady. "With all due respect, Miss Callahan, you are what, 30 years old? You weren't here. You didn't see how things worked." He tilted his head slightly. "What you have is a valuable property, a mine with ore still in it, and the opportunity to make an intelligent arrangement. I was prepared to purchase this land from your grandfather at a fair price. I am prepared to make the same offer to you." "How much?" $22,000. It was a fortune. Nora knew that. It was more money than she would earn in 10 years of bookkeeping, more than she would need to go anywhere and start anything. She held his gaze for a long moment. "The names on the walls," she said. "The 17 I counted, and the ones higher up where the light didn't reach. The woman who died without a name in March of 1877. Do you know who they were?" Cray did not answer. "Because I believe you do," she continued. "You brought them here. You signed the contracts with them. You knew what was happening in that mine with far more detail than my grandfather ever wanted to admit. That is a serious accusation. It is an observation. It is not yet an accusation." There was a silence. The wind moved the canvas awning above the porch with a soft, steady sound. One of Cray's horses stamped the ground below, and the man holding the reins pulled back without looking up. "What do you want?" Cray asked, and for the first time in that conversation, his voice came out differently. Not humble. He had no humility in him, but direct. The smile was entirely gone. "I'm still deciding," Nora said. What Nora did over the following 6 days was this. She hired Aldous Fitch to conduct a thorough search of territorial immigration and labor records between 1874 and 1880. She wrote letters to the Methodist Church in Flagstaff, to the priest of a Mexican congregation in Prescott, and to a newspaper in Santa Fe that had published articles on labor conditions in the territory's mines. She asked Breck to copy every name from the chamber, with the dates and figures beside them, onto clean paper. It was not clear that anyone living could receive what she was trying to return. Many of the names were men who had come from far away, with no known family in the territory. But 2 of the surnames appeared in the Flagstaff parish registers. Even one had a daughter now in her early 40s living in Winslow. Another had a brother who still worked for the railroad, according to the priest. Nora went to Winslow. The woman's name was Pilar. She was 42 years old with dark and tired eyes and hands that showed a lifetime of hard work. When Nora explained who she was and why she had come, Pilar stood in the doorway for a long time without saying anything. Then she turned and went inside, and Nora wasn't sure whether she should leave. But Pilar came back with a bowl of coffee and sat down on the steps, and they stayed there talking until the sun was gone. Pilar's father had left Chihuahua in 1874 with the promise of land after 2 years of work. He had never come back. The family had waited more than a decade before accepting that he wasn't going to. Pilar had grown up believing he had chosen not to return, that he had found another woman, another life, that he had simply walked away. Carrying that was different from carrying grief. It was a wound without a defined shape, something you couldn't properly name. Nora had no way to give back the father. She had no way to undo what the mine had done. But when she returned to Cimarron Creek, she had made a decision. She did not sell to Cray. She did not keep the mine either. What she did, and Fitch spent 3 days arguing against it before accepting that no argument would move her, was this. She donated the mine to the territory with one condition recorded at the notary's office: that the proceeds of any future operation be applied first toward identifying and compensating the descendants of the workers listed in the chamber records, to the extent that they could be found. There was no guarantee the territory would honor the agreement. There was no certainty that anyone would care enough to follow the instructions of a young woman from Flagstaff that nobody knew. The territorial law of 1882 had no clear mechanism for this kind of obligation, but it was written down in her own handwriting with witnesses, with the notary's seal printed in the corner of the page. Vernon Cray found out within 48 hours. He sent a letter with threatening legal language, citing verbal agreements made with Elias Callahan that gave him right of first purchase on the property. Fitch replied formally. Nora did not reply at all. Cray did not sue. Men like him rarely sue when the lawsuit would require the documents of the era to come into public view. The ranch land Nora sold, not to Cray, but to a farming family that had arrived from Ohio the year before and wanted to plant wheat on the plains south of the property. It was a couple with 3 children and a quiet determination that Nora recognized immediately as the kind of thing that makes a life last in a hard place. With the money, she went back to Flagstaff. She paid her debts, she set aside a reserve, and with what remained, she did something she had been putting off for years. She opened a small accounting office on the main street with a sign in the window that read simply, N. Callahan, Bookkeeping Services. It was not easy. Men in the territory were not accustomed to bringing their accounts to a woman, and the first months were lean. But there were widows with properties to manage, and there were merchants who preferred discretion over reputation, and there were 1 or 2 young lawyers without enough pride to let competence pass them by. Slowly, the sign in the window began to mean something. She did not think about her grandfather every day, but she thought of him often. Elias Callahan had been a man who had done things that should not have been done, and who at the end of his life had chosen to carry the weight of that rather than pass it on. Sealing the door and taking the key to his grave was a form of resolution. Incomplete, unsatisfying, but human in the most uncomfortable sense of that word. He had not been a storybook villain. He had been a man with ambition and with limits, who had crossed a line without quite seeing where it was, and who, when he finally saw it, found no way back that didn't cost everything. Nora didn't know if she forgave him. The word seemed too large, too imprecise. What she knew was that she did not want to be defined by inheritance. Not by her grandfather's, not by her father's absence. She wanted to be defined by what she chose to do with what had come into her hands. The iron key she kept in a drawer at the office. She didn't throw it away. She didn't display it. She simply left it there as a reminder that certain doors once opened do not close again, and that this is not always a tragedy. Sometimes it is only the truth finally arriving at the place where it needed to be. There is something the American West teaches with brutal clarity about inheritance. Receiving something from someone does not mean that something is clean. Land passes from hand to hand, but what was done on it does not disappear with the transfer of title. The names written in charcoal on the walls of a dark chamber do not vanish because the door was locked. They stay there, waiting for someone stubborn or brave enough to walk in with a lantern. Elias Callahan chose to lock the door and take the secret with him. Nora Callahan chose to open it and face what was inside. Not because she was braver than her grandfather, but because she had nothing left to lose by pretending the key didn't exist. The heaviest inheritance any property, mine, your herd of cattle can carry is the responsibility of deciding what to do with the past of those who came before. And that decision cannot be inherited. It belongs always and only to whoever is still alive to make it. If this story touched something in you, a reflection on family, on the weight of the past, on what we choose to do with what we receive, leave a comment below. Tell us what you would have done in Nora's place. Would you have sold the mine, kept it, or done what she did? There is no wrong answer. There is only what each of us is willing to carry. And if you haven't hit the like button yet, now is the moment. It's the simplest way to say these stories are worth your time, and it helps us keep telling more of them. Until the next story, and may it be worthy of your attention.